All right, you guys, here we go with our video structural report. Here's our guy.
Hi, so my name's Tony Lucchini. I'm a structural engineer with Lucchini Trujillo Structural Engineers. So we're starting back in the casita, which, as you know, is constructed of adobe. Ben tells me your main area of concern is this back wall, where we've been getting a lot of exposure to moisture over the years. As you can tell, runoff from the roof, splashes on here, it's staining the stucco, and that moisture is going to build up, penetrate the stucco, especially in these areas where you can see that the stucco is actually fallen off and delaminated. If there is some significant erosion, I would say, it is repairable, but it has occurred in this lower corner here, in so much as that maybe you're losing, a good half of the thickness of your block, which could be leading to some of these vertical cracks that you see at the corner, just some compression and settlement of that wall. It is something, like I said, that you can repair, and the repair would probably consist of using some type of dry pack concrete, which is something, it's a dry mix that they could control and just kind of stuff it in there. And that would, gain your contact back from the wall down to the lower foundation, which I would assume is down there, maybe, a rubble type of footing, which is concrete mixed with river rock. But what you really want to do around here is control the water, because you want to stabilize the moisture content in the wall, which will really help to give you extra years to its life. So what I would recommend, and I've had some projects where there's significant erosion of the adobe that's not visible, I would recommend taking off the stucco and so that you can get eyes on the adobe just to verify that it's all in good condition. That is a lot of work, I know, but I think it's it's time well spent. And also gaining control of the moisture so that we don't get this splashing effect on here, either through gutters, what have you, and probably removing some of the dirt here. It's built up pretty well up against this wall, probably higher than it should be, because like I said, there's going to be some type of foundation a little ways down, and the intent is that dirt really isn't up to the adobe level, because we don't want moisture wicking through and degrading that adobe over time.
Great.
I'll just say this crack here, there's a transition between adobe, you can hear that real solid, and a fur out where they were trying to fit the opening to the window. You can hear that, the window's rattling, but has a different sound in there. So likely what happened is you have a little bit of movement shifting in the building over time. So this is a good place where you're going to get a little bit of rotation in the system, where you have a change in materials, you have a change in volume change with temperature over time, and that consistent movement is just going to develop these cracks, which is obviously propagated pretty well over the years.
Do you think that is a crack as a result of this wall sliding into the earth? Or is it more, do you think, related to the different materials in the joint that you refer to?
It's more than likely started due to the differing materials. I think what could be happening is that you're getting a little bit of that built-up erosion in this corner, so you might have a little bit of settlement going on here. And this is just a good place where the building's going to relieve itself in a crack that was already formed. And you can see as the crack goes up, it widens, so that means that there is some movement this way. It's, we're talking about 3/16, maybe a quarter of an inch up here, which really isn't that bad, but the nature of adobe is that it's very brittle. A little bit of movement is going to cause a crack. It's not like wood framing or reinforced concrete even, where you have wood is flexible, concrete has the steel to hold that tension. Adobe really has nothing. So if there's movement, it's going to spread apart and it's going to crack. But it it doesn't seem significant. Like I said, usually the biggest impact of cracks in adobe is that it's a place for moisture to get in and kind of cause some damage.
So the takeaway here is get the moisture under control, shore up underneath these bricks, expose the adobe if you can to see what's really going on.
That's right.
And keep an eye on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we don't need to go inside, but the inside is relatively clean. And by that I mean there's no significant cracks even in this area. So there's a lot of things that can lead to that. The interiors are usually finished more often, new paint or replastering, what have you. So they could be hiding cracks underneath the walls, but typically if movement is ongoing, you know, unless the interior was finished within the last few years, you know, you would expect an ongoing movement to still relay and telegraph back to the interior.
Makes sense. Okay, where to next?
Let's go, I guess let's walk around this end of the main house. All right, so for the most part, the exterior is pretty clean as well. I don't know how, this seems to be really old stucco, if you can call it that. It might probably more of a concrete mix. But like I said, unless this was redone in the last few years, it's really clean and not indicative of current movement. So what I usually look for are cracks coming off of the edges of openings, windows, doors. Those are areas of stress concentrations.
Mm-hmm.
So if something wants to move, it's going to move at a weak joint. It's going to move at a sharp angle, and you're going to get cracks at those locations typically before you do anywhere else. So the fact that there's really little of that is a good sign. As we move along here in a bit, you'll see that there's a lot of movement at some point in some of the perimeter stem walls and in the basement area. I would tend to think that has been there for many years because of the fact that the exterior is relatively clean in regards to cracks.
We don't see a lot of patching on this exterior.
That's right. It doesn't seem like anything has happened probably at least in the last 10 years, I would say. I'm not a stucco or exterior expert, but that's just from what I've seen. That's kind of the time range I would give it.
We know that stucco is hard to match and that this is a particular texture that's even more unusual.
That's right. So more than likely it was just painted over, which I think if there were any larger cracks, that would still be visible, or at least that patchwork would be visible.
Sure.
So one of the issues that I've found is the fireplace is leaning quite a bit. I would say it's probably leaning about a foot at the top, based on what I can see here, where it meets the roof. You can see that it's pulled the stucco away from the wall, and over the years, as the fireplace rotates outward, you can see that they keep patching those cracks over and over and over again.
Is there any possibility that the line that we're seeing the field of this wall heading towards the fireplace bending out like that was original?
I would tend to say no, just because of the evidence of the patchwork.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see at the top where there's a pretty good gap back in there. I don't think that would be original. I don't see, I guess, a reason why they would have done it in this manner. And just the fact that it's leaning, that outward movement against the soffit there seems to match the movement of the fireplace.
Okay.
Yeah, and then also up on the roof, you can see where they've kind of fought that movement with reflashing So probably a point of moisture over the years. The movement of the fireplace is something that can be stabilized. I don't know the rate that it's moving, and I can't really comment on whether it's on the verge of falling or not. That has so much to do with the quality of the workmanship and the materials, which I really know nothing about without some heavy testing. But one way is to come in here with some helical piles, which are essentially big screw anchors that you put in the ground. You would install them right along the back side of the fireplace and attach them to the bottom, and at least ensure that the fireplace doesn't settle any more from its current state. And then we would probably recommend some type of tiebacks into the main roof structure just to help it and give it that extra bracing support.
All right.
So the other main area of concern, I guess I would say, is in this area where these two window wells are. There's a slight outward movement between.
You know, I can actually see how the base of the window is further inboard.
Correct. And it's much more evident from the basement, but what seems to be happening is that this area, this is all retaining, it's a basement wall, so this soil wants to push in, and that basement wall has to resist that soil from pushing in. And most soils are relatively stable on their own as long as they stay dry. This area is pretty wet, and it seems like it stays wet, especially being on this side of the house. I think is this the north end. But there is some rotation. So, I don't know how recent the movement is. It's probably somewhat active. And you'll see later that they've tried to patch it on the interior. So I'll touch on that a little bit more, but I just wanted to kind of show the exterior of it. So remember that the grade comes up just under the windows, some inward movement. The rest of the perimeter of the house all seems to be relatively plumb or vertical. Mm-hmm. This is the only area of the basement that extends all the way to the exterior. Everything else that you walk around is all crawl space, so there's not much retaining going on. The floor is probably about this high out of the crawl space, and a little bit of differential from the crawl space grade to the exterior grade, but not enough to be a retaining situation, and it's stayed vertical.
I'm observing as I'm standing here regarding your comments about staying wet, how we have a disconnected drain pipe.
That's right.
That is disappearing into some sort of a quasi-French drain, broken old clay pipe with water in it.
It's plugged, I guess, somewhere.
It's plugged, so I'm sure it's just slowly leaching into the ground somewhere.
Right. So one of the big things, even in this area where there's concrete, the area seems to stay pretty saturated. The key to keeping the foundation system, especially of this age, of pretty much stacked block that's ungrouted, meaning it's concrete masonry units, cinder block. It has the hollow cores, and you can either grout the hollow cores solid or leave them hollow and just use the mortar bed joints to kind of lock them into place. They've gone the hollow route here, which it isn't the best way to go about it, but it works. But it also allows for probably a little bit more moisture seepage into the interior. And if the cores aren't solid grouted, there's no reinforcing in them.
Are you saying that this punch out area here is the hollow block?
More than likely, yeah.
Okay.
This is a build out which is not visible from the interior.
Okay.
But it's more than likely the same thing. So you really want to probably regrade or hardscape the immediate area around the house, just so that you don't have as much moisture right up against the foundation.
All right, makes sense.
Now Ben said you're pretty much aware that the floor is unlevel. That's a given. You have a joisted floor. Wood 2x joists. They're not really modern 2x's, but they're pretty hefty. But they go to intermediate beams, and those beams are supported on columns, I would say, which are for the most part 2x columns, so they're not significant, but they're sitting on, like a block of CMU, what your perimeter walls are made out of. So they don't have large footings, so that differential movement and settlement over the years throughout the house causes that unevenness. It's not going anywhere, but you probably, I would say you probably have to live with the unevenness. The only way to really level this out is to come in and add like a lightweight concrete, which adds weight, and it's going to be a cyclic effect where you're going to cause more settlement. So, if you're fine with the floors like this, great, because I would suggest that they probably stay that way.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is the area under the two window wells here that we were just talking about. You can see that they've put, just like a stucco, if you will, over the,
like a gray coat. Yeah,
just a gray coat. I'm not sure why. Maybe just to hide or try and contain the efflorescence that comes through. This is a good area where you can see some active moisture kind of actually coming through, so that the moisture works to really degrade the bond between the block and the mortar. And you see a little bit of bulge here. That it's, I can't stress enough how important it is to get a hold of the moisture around the perimeter. That would solve a lot of problems. Probably even help to reduce the load on this wall from the soil, and really extend the life of the foundation. But what I want to point out is that it's hard to see, maybe.
Actually your light, if you put that light up high against the wall.
Can you see the shadowing?
I can see that the shadow, there's a high point. If you back it up a little towards the window, see now that you can see that bulge really well. Yeah. As it shadows right there.
Right, so that's a transition between the concrete stem, which you can see over here pretty well, and where it transitions to block. Like I said, it's not reinforced. The concrete might be of this age, but the block's not, and they're probably not tied together. So over here, as you get built up more pressure from the soil, this concrete wall has pretty much given way, I would say, and is getting pushed inward between the two extreme support points. And as that happens, the block above wants to rotate with it, which causes that out of plumbness of the block wall above that you see.
In fact, as I'm standing here looking at this window frame, it's sitting in there at a pretty extreme angle this way.
There's quite a bit of rotation that's happened with this wall.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I want to back up and get a definitional clarity. When you say block's not tied in, does that mean that they have no mortar, or does that mean there's no reinforcement bar?
There's no reinforcement between the concrete and the block. So what you're depending on...
You're saying where the block meets the concrete at this level.
Correct. The only thing that's there is, like you see over here, just a mortar bed.
I see.
So you get some bond between the two, mostly in a shear sense, so lateral movement. But as things start to rotate, they develop tension on these faces, and mortar, concrete, all of that's not reinforced has pretty little tensile strength. So as that wall wants to move, it basically breaks the tensile bond, and allows this rotation to happen. And if we were to take this out, there's going to be a pretty big gap here, I'm assuming, between the concrete and the block above it. As far as a repair goes, I would probably consider this wall negligible in the repair. So that means that I would want to put a new wall, probably coming out another 6 to 8 inches, shotcrete, which just means that it's concrete that's applied through a gun, applied directly to a wall. We could put a mat of reinforcing, and that wall would need to tie to some type of bracing. You know, we can build it inward in by way of like a buttress, or we could use helical piles, same thing that I mentioned at the fireplace, but drill them laterally, grab hold of the soil that's back here in the driveway, and those piles get anchored into this new shotcrete wall that gets applied to the surface. So now, as that soil pushes more this way, it pushes on the new shotcrete wall. That shotcrete wall grabs hold of the anchors, and the anchors really, they don't let that wall move inward anymore.
It sounds pretty permanent.
Yeah.
Is this, I know this may be a question you can't answer entirely, but are we heading towards anything that would be considered catastrophic, that you could say, like, this is dangerous?
Again, it's hard to say. It's like the fireplace. It's definitely has moved significantly over the years. I don't know what the tipping point is. Like I said, it's based on craftsmanship and material strengths, which I really don't know. And again, I don't know how long this layer of concrete's been here, but it seems relatively old already. I would put this probably relatively high on our repair list, though. Simply because there's no reinforcing in here. So if it does start to fail, there's no steel to really to yield, if you will, to cause a slow failure. I think you're gonna start seeing a quick widening of this crack. I don't think it would collapse all the way, but the earlier you get to it, the easier the repair would be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. A big piece of the repair being control the moisture.
Yeah, that's the first step, and that's something we'd want to do with repair or without repair. Yeah. Good thing though is this seems to be the only segment of wall. It's a relatively short segment of wall. Everything else seems to be really plumb. There's no rotation of the lower concrete stem wall, and the block on top has stayed plumb on it as well. You can see, so this is something that happens with ungrouted, unreinforced block, is that if with movement things might get a little loose and you have an impact, it slides right out. It's really dependent on just that surface bond of the mortar to the block. Now if you look in here, this is probably the worst location for the perimeter stem wall. You can see over there there's been a lot of movement and shifting between the blocks. I don't know if this area was impacted at some point, but those blocks
they got popped in, didn't they?
Yeah, they've I think something hit it.
Well, that is the driveway corner.
Oh, that's true.
Right?
That's true.
It's possible the vehicle
someone
tapped
had
it.
a late night.
Right?
But they all seem to be relatively tight in a vertical sense. You know, there's a little bit of movement from shifting, from settlement, but for the most part, they seem to be pretty clean all the way down, as far as I could see. This is really the worst part, but I don't, from a vertical sense, it's fine. There's no really outward leaning one way or the other.
Right.
So I think they're even if you can say they're loosely stacked at worst, they're not going to fall down without some impact.
Right. Try not to hit the house with the car.
So the basement is pretty much confined to the north side of the house, the far north end. Everything else, it's hard to see back in this way with all the duct work, and there's been a little bit of excavation here for something. But from what I can tell, the block is pretty clean all the way back. There's back in the very far corner, I can't tell if it's brick or maybe it's the fireplace that I'm looking at, but there's a different type of material.
That circle, that white, that looks like duct tube to me.
Even further, yeah, there's this duct here, and then underneath.
Oh,
that,
I see some like red brick.
Yeah. And that's probably the fireplace.
Let's see if I can get this camera to focus on that. And there it is. The base of the fireplace, you think? It certainly is in the right spot, I think.
Yeah.
All right.
So just for location reference,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the rest of the basement looks pretty good. I'm assuming this area is probably getting a lot of moisture. You can see the, you know, that stucco patch is pretty wet.
I think this area here is our porch on the other side of this.
That's correct, it is. And then probably being on the north side, the soil just doesn't dry out.
Yeah.
So, you know, nowadays we'd spend a lot of time waterproofing the walls. I don't know how much of that they did in the 30s.
Right.
So the best you can do is just to control the surface drainage.
And
And this is an Adobe basement extension. I'm not this is probably I would assume this is an addition of some type. Could be that they dug it out themselves at some point and came in and stacked the Adobe, but who knows. I don't really see any significant damage to the Adobe, so there's not a lot of moisture coming through with Adobe. You would definitely see that. Until we turn around here. Good thing about this isn't the exterior, this is interior, but obviously there was a pretty good leak at some point and eroded the Adobe in this area. If I don't see that this is really supporting a whole lot, there seems to be a beam over here, though it does have some water damage, which is pretty typical of a lot of the wood in the area here. So I would say as long as this remains dry, I don't see that it would really have a severe effect on anything. Just something to point out.
Sure.
You might want to look at, along with some of the other termite affected joists, you'd probably want to sister something up against a lot of these members at some point, just because they've experienced either water damage or termite damage, and you know that causes rot, softening of the wood, and of course loss of strength. So there are some select wood members in the visible area that probably would need some attention, though that's a relatively minor repair, I would say.
All right.
Yeah. I think that's it.
Yeah.
There's one of the termite joists. They're pretty apparent, so definitely not something that you'll miss if you spend the time looking around.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anything else that you want to walk to and talk to?
No, I think on the interior, you know, I spent a good time looking around. There are hairline cracks here and there, but they're pretty hairline, which means that they're not very active. The current coating hasn't changed that much. You know, if those cracks were larger, it would mean they probably have some active movement, but there hasn't been much movement since the last time it was painted or retextured or what have you.
Sure.
So yeah, there's not a whole lot to point out in the interior. Other than the unevenness of the floor, the walls seem to be in really good condition.
Sure. All right, well, fantastic.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.